This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres and movies from the past. Each month we'll have a theme. This month we will be taking a look at the modern Planet of the Apes trilogy. Each week we'll pick a movie related to that theme, and this week we will be looking at 2011's Rise of the Planet of the Apes.
You've been invited here to make history.
This drug could save millions of lives. When we test one subject, I want to make sure it's stable.
Oh, he's a smart one, isn't he?
You told him to sign?
Just a handful of things.
Caesar's skills far exceed that of a human.
Some things aren't meant to be changed.
That ship's company property.
Keep your emotions out of it.
We have a responsibility.
We will proceed, with or without you.
You have no idea what you're dealing with.
Rated PG-13.
My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing, including my recently completed Breaking Bad rewatch. As Kevin and I, our podcast came out last Tuesday. We discussed the final season of Breaking Bad, and you can go check that out. You can also check out what Matt and Ben are doing with There Will Be Movies, as they are getting into their 25 best movies of the 2010s. That project is commencing. You can check out some of their prior work, including Punchy Kicking Men, Brian, where they discussed John Wick and the Raid series. So you can all check that out on The Real World. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, all I can say to you is, people have probably not noticed this, but we have not recorded a podcast in about a month or so. We banked the Lord of the Rings episodes in advance. We took the month of June off so that we could focus on other things. And Brian, the entire world has changed since we last recorded a podcast.
It feels like every time we record a new podcast, the time in between, the world changes in significant ways, and certainly different aspects of the world, sports, wrestling, what have you, and everything is just coming together and just, I don't know, everything's just being revealed and exposed, and lies are coming out and truths are being told and people are speaking out. So yeah, crazy times, but as the world burns, I wouldn't say it's burning, it's just, it's cycling over again. Things are anew, things are becoming anew, times are changing. But in that month, since we've last recorded, I've also stocked up on some Blu-rays and DVDs because I was having some Wi-Fi issues earlier in the month, and it made me think, man, even though I have HBO Max, yeah, the Wi-Fi goes out and I don't have any data on my phone, can't use it. So been buying some physical media. That Lord of the Rings binge, it got me going. So it got me thinking that I should start watching the Hobbit movies again, and I watched the Hobbit movies again. And yeah, I kind of enjoyed them, and I know Jerome doesn't like them as much. The third one is not so good, but I certainly enjoyed the first one again, so I got those for cheap on Blu-ray. Picked up some of the animated ones from the past as well, The Hobbit, the animated Lord of the Rings, and The Return of the King, and all that stuff. So I've been collecting, also started collecting and finalized my collection of the Planet of the Apes movies. I actually bought the Tim Burton one for about $2 used. So I now own every single Planet of the Apes movie. I'm a big mark, so I'm glad we're doing this little trilogy analysis for the new ones. I'm really excited about it.
Absolutely. I think that these movies are so good, and I really hadn't had a chance to rewatch any of them. I saw them in theaters, and I think I was especially impressed by War for the Planet of the Apes, and we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about our relationship with some of the prior ape movies as well, because this is not just a trilogy, of course. There are 6 previous movies to discuss that we have watched. Neither one of us, I don't believe, have seen the television show that aired in the 70s or the animated series, or have read any of the graphic novels or books and whatnot, but we will certainly be discussing our relationship in just a few minutes. But yeah, so much has changed around the world, and we hope that you are staying safe, being healthy, wearing a mask. That is most important. Wear a mask, people. I can't emphasize that enough. It is proven to save lives, so make sure that you are doing that. And if not, then I will yell at you because you're a terrible person and you're extremely selfish. That's really all that can be said about wearing masks.
Yeah, I'm going through the same thing at work, man. I work at a hotel. I'm refusing to help people if they're not wearing masks. So hell yeah, wear a goddamn mask. Even the people in the 2011 version of Rise of the Planet of the Apes, they're telling you to wear a mask because that's where, well, not the real virus started, but we'll get into the virus in this movie later on. But yeah, wear a mask, people. Luckily, there's no blood coming out of people's noses, though.
Yeah, that is a relief. And Franklin didn't wear one, and we will see what happened to Franklin. So we've done some check-ins. I do want to let people know before we get into this too deep that you should presume that we are going to spoil all of the Planet of the Apes movies up to and including Rise of the Planet of the Apes. So keep that in mind, of course. Planet of the Apes movies are known for their twist endings, and you should presume that we are going to discuss all of the twists, or potentially all of the twists, for all of those 8 movies. So please keep that in mind as you listen to this podcast. We're not going to get right into it. You're going to have a few minutes, but just again, keep that in mind. So Brian, in between our ending of our last recording and this recording, I have started ranking my 100 favorite movies of all time. Brian, any responses, any thoughts on my list so far?
Yeah, it's pretty much what I expected. Some old stuff coming in. I want to see some more animated movies on the list soon. But yeah, it's about where I'm at on some familiar stuff, except Social Network. I don't know if I'll ever watch Social Network because I'm not a Facebook guy. I never was a fan of Facebook. And the tone of that movie seems so, I don't know, man, so polarizing. That's all I can say about it. It's a turn off for me. But hey, man, Fincher's your guy, so there you go.
The Social Network is amazing. One of the best movies of the 2010s. And yeah, I mean, I really, really enjoy it. And yes, there will be some more animated stuff forthcoming. Pixar is going to be well represented on the list, but I'm trying to save a lot of the Disney stuff for towards the end, when I'm running out of time. And I'm trying to get through a lot of the longer movies now when I have more time in the summer, and then I'll get to some of the animated stuff as we go along and into the rest of 2020. But make sure that you are going to the Real World. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, you will see a review from me as I talk about my 100 favorite movies of all time. And Brian, you will be relieved to know that I was smart enough to release the Independence Day review on Independence Day, and I can think of no other way to celebrate that holiday than Will Smith saving us from aliens.
Yeah, that's I was a little surprised you had it on the list, but it is one of those big 90s movies that kind of takes you back and has a nostalgic feel, so I get it, man. And that is an iconic visual of the White House blowing up, so I totally get it. But yeah, I'm never going to watch the sequel, that's for sure. So, but I'm glad it's on the list because it's definitely one of those top, I don't know, pop culture moments, I think, in movie history, seeing that White House blow up. So that's just iconic.
We do not talk about the sequel on this show, just like we do not talk about Independence Day sequel. We do not talk about Rocky V. There's a list of movies that we just pretend, especially the sequel variety, that we don't acknowledge they exist.
I'll acknowledge the Rocky V soundtrack because they got an underrated Elton John song on there. But other than that, yeah, Rocky V, not so good.
And you will be very excited to see at least 2 of the movies that are forthcoming in the Rocky franchise, because there are 2 from 2 of the 7 movies are going to make it.
And I know exactly which two, and you're making me teary-eyed just making me think about one of them, and that little moment where he's shadowboxing with that image of his father in the background.
All right, so we are going to discuss the Planet of the Apes movies. We're going to get to our discussion of Rise in a few minutes, but there are, of course, 5 Planet of the Apes movies that came out beforehand. There is the original that came out in 1968. This is an iconic movie starring Charlton Heston. It is one of the first times that we have seen kind of science fiction hit the mainstream, so to speak. I think it had obviously hit the mainstream with some episodes of The Twilight Zone, but I think sci-fi horror, they had mostly been relegated to kind of B-movies, and this was an opportunity for sci-fi to come to the mainstream, and that, of course, continued on in other sequels. Planet of the Apes, of course, had a huge twist ending when it is revealed that Taylor was, in fact, on Earth all along. And then we go into Beneath the Planet of the Apes, where the ending is the whole world literally blows up. And we go to Escape from the Planet of the Apes, where 2 of the apes have escaped and gone onto Earth. And that leads into Conquest of the Planet of the Apes and Battle of the Planet of the Apes. 2 movies. Those latter 2 have kind of been remade. Rise is kind of a remake of Conquest. Dawn is kind of a remake of Battle, except they're much, much better. And this is the first time, Brian, not the first time, but this is one of the first occasions when I think we saw sequels kind of hitting the mainstream, and I think we've gotten so used to franchise filmmaking that we almost forget that there was a time when, people really didn't do sequels. Charlton Heston did not want to really be involved with Planet of the Apes beyond the first one. His role in Beneath the Planet of the Apes is relegated to basically a cameo, and the quality of the movies varies. The budgets of the movies slowly go down as the returns go down, and this is pretty surprising because I think when we think of sequels now, we think of them as being bigger than the original movies, and all of the original cast always comes back, but that just was not the case prior to at that time in the late 60s and the early 1970s.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Godzilla sequels where like they bring actors back, but in the Godzilla case, they never had them recurring roles, like playing the recurring roles. They would play a different role each time, and they'd be in multiple Godzilla movies in the 60s and 70s. But I don't know, it's weird because that first one was so huge and it did so much money for 20th Century Fox, and then I guess they tried to go all out with the second one, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and I think that they just went a little too much with it because, as I recall, I watched the documentaries back in the day. The reason that they wanted to lower the budget for the third movie so much because there was just so much in the makeup in the second one, and they were trying to go all out to make that money again, like they did with the first one. But once that happened, it kind of backfired. But the fans were still there. But they still wanted to, make money out of the franchise, which is why they scaled it back and did the third one with only 2 people in costume, with Roddy McDowall and the wife, Sierra. So yeah, it's interesting because each movie, they lessen the budget each one, but I still feel like because they lessen the budgets in the later sequels, despite how you feel about the 5th one, I still feel like 3 and 4, something about those 2, even though they're just scaled back, I don't know, they come up with these unique plots. You know what I mean? The fact that, in the third one, they're going back in time to the current Earth and then telling them what's going on and revealing the future and that the planet's going to get destroyed and everything becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy by the end. And it turns out that their baby Caesar ends up becoming the Caesar that starts the revolution of the apes in the 4th one. So it's all this stuff coming together. I thought that was really unique, even though it was scaled back. But then the 5th one, they try to bring it back to what it was in the first 2 with this culture and stuff that was already established, but it just doesn't hit right. So yeah, it's interesting the history of the series. I was even a fan of the TV series, the selected. I think it's like 1 season that they made, but they reran them on Sci-Fi all the time in the 90s. So I was a sci-fi kid, like I mentioned before. I was watching Quantum Leap. I watched that. Some other things on the Sci-Fi Channel. So yeah, everything was right. And then they replay these movies all the time on the Sci-Fi Channel and TNT and all that stuff. So over time, like the kids of the 90s became fans of Planet of the Apes, which is why I think that they tried to bring it back with the Tim Burton version. We know how that just kind of went off the rails a little bit. And even though I added it to my collection, it was only a couple bucks, but I still like the makeup in that one. So yeah, I think what it is, man, I just love the practical look and makeup of the apes. in the first two movies, and they kind of bring those to the sequels later on. Even though they kind of scaled back on the makeup and they did rubber masks as opposed to physical latex makeup layers, but is what it is on the budget. But that first movie's still so legendary to me and so iconic, and so it's just parodied a lot too. I mean, The Simpsons. I mean, It Was Earth all along. Dr. Zaius, classic stuff. Phil Hartman, rest in peace. But yeah, it's just all over pop culture, parodied all the time. It was even parodied in Spaceballs, for Christ's sake, which came out of nowhere. So yeah, it's just one of those things that just is iconic in all of pop culture, movie history, and I'm glad we're talking about the new trilogy now, because the new trilogy is interesting in that they went away from that and they're doing CGI. But, you know, again, that's connected to our previous week's episodes where, because of Lord of the Rings, now we got, you know, a new way to do Caesar and the Apes.
I think the thing that has impressed me the most about this series is that it is always interesting. Even the movies that I don't think are as good, I think there's always a talking point to be made about them. Obviously, the first Planet of the Apes is historic in nature. It's like seeing a whole different world. And you mentioned the makeup and you mentioned that stuff, and I think that's really important. But don't underestimate the value of that score either. I mean, I think that score, it's not necessarily as iconic and memorable as John Williams or an Alan Silvestri or a Bill Conti, but you definitely get a real sense of this world when you hear that music for the first time when Taylor is running away from the apes. And I think that's something that shouldn't be underestimated. And I think that ultimately the movies that work the best for me of the first six are the first one and the fourth one. I think Conquest of the Planet of the Apes is an extremely underrated movie because it is so different tonally from the first three. I think the first three movies are very much a different vibe, and I think that when you look at the history of cinema, the 1960s versus the 1970s, those first three are very much a byproduct of the 1960s way and earlier of doing movies with a certain level of cheesiness and, you know, with different kinds of performances. Charlton Heston is not a subtle performer by any means. And then you get to that fourth one and it feels like such a byproduct of what else was going on in movies in the 1970s. And it is so dark. And they had to cut the original ending because it actually was even darker, but they scaled it back, and then they went to kind of a more family-friendly type movie for the fifth one, which I don't think is all that spectacular, probably would not warrant a very deep conversation. But, you know, they have brought it back a number of times in a number of different forms. I think the Tim Burton movie, it was a financial success, but it was pretty much savaged by critics, and I think the movie is really bad. I think Mark Wahlberg is a terrible choice to play the lead. I think that they were kind of going for the same vibe as Charlton Heston by having this kind of good-looking, you know, white dude kind of playing the role, and it didn't work. And I think coming into this new franchise, one of the things that really concerned me was how are they going to do the apes, because it's a situation where we're not doing makeup and they're not really kind of anthropomorphic animals. They're still apes, and they're still more animalistic than humanistic. So how is that all going to come about? How is that going to be portrayed? And between 2001 and 2011, when this movie came out, there were a lot of technological advances. Lord of the Rings had a lot to do with that. I would say The Matrix had a lot to do with that. Disney was starting to remake their live action movies. And so you got a lot of these advancements. How could I not mention Avatar as well? Avatar really, for whatever you think of the movie itself from a technological standpoint, Avatar certainly had a lot to do with some of the advancements in filmmaking. And I think that one of the things that I was really one of the things I was just really concerned about was how are the apes actually going to be rendered in Rise of the Planet of the Apes?
Yeah, that was my feeling too. Because going in, like, I did not watch this movie in theaters, and I kind of regret it. Because I didn't have like I had mixed feelings towards Rise of the Planet of the Apes when I heard about it. Like, I heard it was an origin story, and at the time, I think I was just kind of sick of like, oh, why do we have to do another origin story? Like, just give me the apes in action and whatnot. Because if you're going to do this origin story, they're not going to be, the Planet of the Apes that I know. And that was kind of like the thing that was kind of holding me back from it. And then, um, you know, it was what it was. And then I saw that it was CGI, and then I heard it was Andy Serkis. I was like, oh, that's interesting. But then, like, what's the story here? And then I was like, oh, it's Caesar. But then Caesar was what, the original ape, and then I guess they're just retconning it. So I was kind of confused. And then I just gave in, and I just went to Redbox. I used Redbox in 2012 because it came out in August 2011. I was early 2012. I rented it, and I was surprised, man. It really shocked me, like how well thought out it was, and the way that the script was put together and everything. So I was surprised at the way they put it all together. And then once halfway through the movie, once they start building the community and the family and all that stuff with the other apes, that's kind of how I saw how they're going to do it. But then, it still had some really confusing things. It's like, how tall is Caesar? And then, at one point it looks like he's almost as tall as James Franco, but then in other scenes he seems so much shorter. So there was a little bit of inconsistencies there. That was my one concern with the CGI in terms of like the heights. You know what I mean? Because I don't know how they're going to match up with all the different heights and scaling and everything. But it had some issues. But that was the only thing. By the second movie, or by Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, they kind of fixed that, I think, in terms of the CGI things. Because you could tell that it was still a little. There's some scenes in Rise that are a little rough on the eyes in terms of CGI, I think, especially on the bridge. But other than that, I think they kind of overcame that and the technology got better. But that was my one concern. And it's kind of hard to see an Apes movie without the makeup and the mask and all that stuff. But once you get past like the first 15 minutes and get into the story, I think it's easy to get into. And it's just a different tone. And it's definitely like not the tone. It's trying to match the tone, probably the early first three movies like you were talking about, with some cheesy lines, however ham-fed they were in this movie. But yeah, it's still enjoyable. And, I kind of regret having that negative attitude about it in the beginning. But once I got into it, Caesar was the man.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I walked into this just very questioning just what this movie was going to be. There were some really positive reviews, and I think that's what pushed me into wanting to see this movie. Ultimately, I think that there are times when I will read reviews, and I think that can be a really valuable experience. I mean, a movie like Avengers Endgame, I don't need to read the reviews because I'm going to see that no matter what. But if I'm questioning whether I want to really watch something and dedicate my time and money to see it, then I'm going to read the reviews. And the reviews for this movie were very positive. And I think that there are a lot of reasons that this movie works, and we're going to get into that. But what's fascinating to me is that in looking at sort of the history of this movie, I think there's a lot of reasons that the movie works. First, the script, which is written by Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver. Originally, in 2006, this was a completely unrelated project that was called Genesis, that was centered around an evil genetically engineered chimpanzee that was raised at a human home and was very smart, but only spoke in sign language. So originally, this movie was a completely different property and probably would have been something a little bit different. Sounds like more of the horror genre than science fiction. But the fact that this was something designed to be originally something else, I think is interesting to point out, because I think the parts of Rise of the Planet of the Apes that sometimes don't work is some of the stuff that takes place in the lab, and some of the human subplots I don't think necessarily work as well in this movie. But ultimately, I think it's totally necessary given where we're going in the next two.
Yeah, it's just those lab scenes were just kind of like, I don't know, it just felt kind of average. But I think that was, I think they tried to just make it more family friendly, like I said, and it just something about those scenes just kind of felt, I don't know, kind of safe. But once they started going into the whole captivity thing and all that stuff with Caesar and all that stuff, I think the second half of the movie is so much better than the first, even though I do like the idea that it's about Alzheimer's, trying to cure Alzheimer's. And I think that's a really moral, thing, he's trying to save his father and all that kind of thing. And John Lithgow is the father of James Franco's character in this movie, and he's suffering from Alzheimer's. And that's just something that, millions around the world just are relating to in terms of, there's people we know, in that situation with a family member. So it's very relatable. So I thought that idea made it really relatable. And I think that's what kind of started with, putting that idea out there, allowed the audience to connect a little bit, more of a human connectivity to it, even though it's about apes. But this idea that the whole idea of this virus thing started out as just, we're trying to cure Alzheimer's. And I thought that was just such an interesting and fascinating idea, and how it spiraled out of control and it pretty much turns into this Jurassic Park scenario where they're almost quoting Jurassic Park, which is the other thing I thought it was kind of, like it felt like Jurassic Park at the beginning of it. You know what I mean? With the whole engineering thing, experimenting, even the whole thing where they grab there's a scene at the beginning where someone's hand gets grabbed and gets pulled, and it's almost like reminiscent of the Velociraptor scene at the beginning of Jurassic Park. So I thought they were going for that kind of feel, which is fine. Like that's kind of what the vibe that they should be going for anyway. But yeah, it just felt like they were kind of playing it safe at the first half. But that's just kind of how I felt. But once you get into the whole captivity thing and they start breaking out, that's when it starts feeling like this big, revolutionary type movie, and it's just more than about the apes, and it gets to the heart of where the original Planet of the Apes movie was, I think.
Well, I think this idea of the apes being in cages, as I pointed out to you when we were DMing each other back and forth, I mean, this is an idea that is all the more relevant as we sit here in the summer of 2020, because there are literally people in cages right now, many of whom are children. And I mean, this is something that we're not rectifying at all. And I think it's really, really unfortunate that we're not. And it's amazing to me that this movie that came out just 10 years ago still remains so relevant. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that there's a virus that starts to kill people and gets spread by a pilot ultimately, and by Franklin. I mean, and that's something that is also just extremely relevant. And the fact that these two really relevant ideas are put forth, I think just adds to the immediacy of this movie. And there's certainly some other notes from the movie that I want to get into, but those two aspects I think are crucial. And these are things that also will come back in the next two movies as well. The thing that I really appreciated just watching these movies back to back to back is that so much of what happens in this movie comes back in Dawn, and then it also comes back in War, with the cages, with the characters, with the virus. All of this stuff that we're talking about isn't just relevant for this movie, but it's going to come back in different ways in other movies.
Yeah, there's this full circle aspect to this whole trilogy that I think they nailed down, especially in the second one, which we'll talk about next week, with the beginning and ending shots of Caesar's eyes literally becoming full circle. So yeah, I just think that the way they set up his arc, it's very well done, because you can tell like the idea that they wanted to create this revolutionary leader out of Caesar, the kind of the way they did in Conquest, like which you mentioned before. I don't know, they really plant these seeds really well done. You know what I mean? Especially the stuff with Koba and how that plays out later on in 2 and 3, and all these different relationships that start out in that sanctuary. It's very well done. And the thing about it is, to me, is that a lot of these characters are silent. So it almost feels like a silent movie at times. You know what I mean? Kind of like the way WALL-E was. But it's just amazing that, I don't know, like there's this complaint that I've been hearing about, I don't want to watch Parasite, there's too many subtitles. And if you watch these movies, there's probably just as many subtitles as in Parasite almost, I think. Because there's a lot going on in the dialogue between the apes, and they can't fully talk yet, but they're doing sign language, and there's all this stuff going on, and this relationship building and world building, and all the stuff that pays off, especially with Maurice, especially in the third movie with Maurice. Like it's very well thought out, and I don't know if they played it that way, but because it feels like the first one here in Rise, in this first one coming back, they kind of played it safe on purpose to get the audience back and not take too many risks. So I appreciate that. But yeah, just those ideas coming full circle again at the end. It's very well done. I think Matt Reeves kind of brought that out more in the second and third movies. Here they just kind of temper or play with the ideas, and then they have fun with the dialogue, which is kind of like, eh. But yeah, they really planted some great seeds here that really played out in the movies later on, and I really appreciate just the little things, because like yeah, you mentioned, I mean, I haven't watched the third one yet recently, but I'm gonna watch it tonight before we record. But yeah, that scene comes full circle when he's giving out the cookies in the first one, and then they're giving out food in the third one too. So everything comes together, man.
Yeah, it comes together so well, and I think that one of the ways that they were able to do this so well is with motion capture. And there was a time when motion capture could only be done in special studios with special cameras, very defined surroundings. And in this movie and then the ensuing sequels, they are able to do motion capture on location. So they are actually able to go to San Francisco and do a lot of this. And I think it makes a huge difference. And if you are doing a movie in San Francisco, then you have to find a way to get the Golden Gate Bridge in there, and you have to film right by the bridge so that you can see the bridge. This is something that literally every movie that takes place in San Francisco has tried to do. Even Avengers Endgame has the same shot of that Golden Gate Bridge. So being able to do motion capture is so crucial. And of course, Brian, this is the second time that Andy Serkis has played an ape. The first time he did this was in 2005's King Kong. That is a movie that probably deserves its own podcast because there's a lot going on in that movie. But Andy Serkis is somebody that we've talked a lot about with Lord of the Rings. And I didn't even realize that Andy Serkis was also in this, as it just didn't even click in my mind. So we're talking a lot about Andy Serkis, but it is a happy coincidence, not something that I was consciously trying to do.
What's crazy is that when I watched this again the other day, I thought Andy Serkis played the motion capture halfway through the movie when he was fully grown at like 8 years old or whatever. Apparently he did the motion capture when he was playing Caesar at 3 years old as well. So can you imagine him like squatting on the ground to be that height? And that's why I kind of mentioned the height and ratio differentials in terms of like the scaling and everything. Because, man, he played it like on his knees. There's some behind the scenes footage I watched where he's just like on his knees in the attic, and they gotta like, they gotta put the height at the right angle. So he's filming it, and then he's talking and looking up to James Franco, and it's really well done. And I was like, man, I thought they just got a kid for that part, but he really went into it. Even I don't know how he did it, man, because God, be crouching on the ground like that for so long, and then gradually getting a little taller to even still, I think he's still crouching. He has to in order to get that motion capture. So credit to him, man, because I think this is just so physically demanding to be, I think more physically demanding than Golem, because it's just, I don't know, because I feel like he's still got to mimic, ape-like movements as well on top of all that. So just a credit to him, man. And again, we mentioned there needs to be some kind of digital actor category because he would clean house almost every year, or especially in the last 10 years, he would just clean house.
For sure. And I think that the other person that we have to talk about is James Franco. He assumed the role of Will, and at one point he was apparently in competition with his fellow 2002 Spider-Man co-star Tobey Maguire. Tobey Maguire was not able to come to a deal. He and the studio, they had a falling out of some sort, and James Franco assumed the role. I'm a bit agnostic as to whether Tobey Maguire would have been better in this role, but it seems to me, based on watching this movie, James Franco is miscast, and I am not a huge fan of his performance. I don't think he really has chemistry with Frida Pinto, and I think that is a huge problem with this movie, because I think what we're able to do is we are really able to invest in the story of the apes, and we're not allowed to do that with the humans, and I think that is a problem that's also going to come up in the next two movies as well. But I don't like James Franco in this role. I'm not a huge James Franco fan anyway, just based on his extracurricular behavior, and there have, of course, been a number of accusations surrounding him. But aside from all of that, there's something about him in this movie with him trying to be very sincere and not a stoner idiot that I just don't buy him as a scientist, man. Like, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, that was the problem for me too. Like, he seems okay. He's decent enough, but there were some parts where I felt like you should have taken it to the next emotional level for some scenes. Like, I felt like when his dad died, there was something missing there from that part of his performance. I felt like it should have been more deeper of a blow, you know what I mean? Like more of an emotional blow, and it didn't seem like he took it as like the way he should have, or the way that character should have. Despite all, like I don't think he cried once in this movie, but he should have at that part. I thought that was really crucial that you got to cry at that point.
Especially with him trying to save his father for so much of the movie, and then he dies, and it barely gets addressed.
Exactly. That's the point I'm making. Yeah, it's just something about that didn't kind of rub me the wrong way, and then something with Frida Pinto's like performance is just I felt like it was totally underwritten, which is another running theme amongst these movies we've been watching in the last 2 years. But written female performance there, and just there was so much potential there. Maybe you don't even need that love interest role, to be honest. She was just there. You know what I mean? I don't even think you needed her, but you maybe could have just turned James Franco's role into a female doctor, and it would have been the same movie. To be honest, it probably would have been more effective. Maybe I don't know, but yeah, it just they kind of set these things up for like the love interest and all that stuff, but that was it was kind of unnecessary. By the halfway through the movie, you're more just focused on Caesar anyway than what's going on with Franco and his relationship, and you really don't care about it. It's like, why establish it anyway? But yeah, it's unfortunate because by the end of the movie, the only reason she's mainly in the movie is to distract the cop at the end, just so Franco can go and try to save Caesar. But again, it was just underwritten. But that's unfortunate. But is what it is. But like I said, the focus is probably mainly on Caesar at this point. So that's probably why they cut Franco from the sequel. I don't even know if they had the intention to bring that character back, because it seems like it was just a one-off origin story type character. A character that was definitely not needed in the sequels later on. But you definitely need, if you're going to tell the story about the doctor making the virus, you need the reason, which was, the Alzheimer's cure and all that stuff. But it's kind of unfortunate that it didn't crescendo, even though I thought probably his best moment was the moment when Caesar whispers in his ear that I'm home, and he has that kind of look. That's probably his best overall reaction in the whole movie. Because I kind of had that same look too. Because the first time I watched that, I was like, that's a powerful moment. And the other thing too is like, despite the performances on the human side or whatever, and Andy Serkis just knocking it out of the park and whatever, but there's still some powerful moments in this movie visually and like kind of metaphorically that I still think kind of stand out. So there's at least it still has that.
Well, you mentioned the Will Caesar relationship and whether this was intended to be a one-off. And originally, we were supposed to see Will die on screen. He was supposed to die sacrificing himself for Caesar. And this is something that was even filmed, but ultimately it's one of those things where we did not see that. We did not see him die. And I think the assumption eventually becomes that he died because of the rapid spread of the virus and not necessarily because he was killed at the end of the first movie. So I think they leave that. I think they left it open a bit on purpose to see, what would come up in ensuing movies and the possibility of him coming back. But ultimately, I'm glad that he did not return. I think Jason Clarke, who we're going to talk about next week, I think he is a far superior performer, even if I think the human characters are still kind of on the weak side. I think his performance is a lot better than James Franco's. But originally intended, this is going to have a pretty dark ending with Will being killed. And that's kind of what Planet of the Apes is known for. And you still do get those dark sequences. I mean, the fact that Caesar does suffer in captivity, I mean, that's not only really, really dark, but it also mirrors what happens to Taylor in Planet of the Apes 1968. He escapes and attacks a keeper. That's the same thing that happens with Charlton Heston. They get confiscated by the authorities. They are attacked with a fire hose. And I think those are the moments. There are times when I think it's a little bit on the cheesy side with some of the lines, like when they have the character say it's a madhouse, it's a madhouse. There's no real context for that line to be said. And when he also says, "Take your hands off me, you damn dirty ape," that also doesn't really have the same context, so it doesn't work as well. And some of those blatant shout outs don't work as well. But I think having him suffer in the same way, I do think that does work, because fire hoses are still used and people in cages, as we've talked about, something that still happens. So I definitely understand why they did this. And I think it still does work. Like I said, the subtle moments when they echo previous movies work. When they try to get more direct and really reference them, I don't think it works as well.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Like, it seems, because I'm all about Easter eggs and stuff like that, but like, I think they just went too far with it towards the end, like quoting the lines exactly like you said, but then out of context. And then I was like, oh, he said it, oh, he said it, it's just like, oh, he said the line. I I was waiting for It Was Earth All Along, but I guess that's not going to happen in terms of the context of the movie. But yeah, it was just kind of like borderline kind of ridiculous, but I don't know. It was very tongue in cheek at points, but I did appreciate it because they did do it for the fans, and I'm probably one of the few people that picked up on the Caesar's mother's name is Bright Eyes, or they named her Bright Eyes, which is what they named Charlton Heston's character when he couldn't speak for himself in the original. So that was cool. But then again, it's like people know that. How many of the casuals know that? But at least they made it for the fans. They scaled it down way more in the second and third movie, except for maybe Nova in the third movie. But other than that, I do like the shout outs, and we got to mention the ship, the Icarus ship, the show in the background. And also there's a background scene where it says it got lost in space. So they set that up. And then in the featurette, I watched the 7-minute featurette. They were mentioning maybe, down the line in future movies, we can come back to that, which would be really cool, which I think is what Disney wants to do, from what I've read, because the Disney owns 20th Century Fox now. And I'm shocked it's not on Disney Plus, these movies. I'm looking at you, Disney Plus. But from what I've heard, they want to continue on from that point with the spaceship. So at least they got some continuity going there. But yeah, I hope that the next director doesn't do as many inside jokes. You know what I mean? Because there was plenty of that in this movie.
There certainly were. And I think that we talk about kind of the female representation, and we do see that Caesar's mother dies early on in the movie, and that's such a great scene because you have the contrast of what's happening in the lab with her running around and whatnot versus what's happening in this meeting, and you're like, well, this ape just went crazy, but she had a logical reason for doing so, and I think that was also really well done, just the way that they executed that. And then we transition from Bright Eyes and our focus being on her to then the focus being on Caesar and watching Caesar grow up. We did not get to see Caesar have a romance with Cornelia. Cornelia does make an appearance in the second and the third movies. She is not really a focal point of this movie. And it just seems like they didn't really handle the romance all that well. But given how important this movie is, and what they're trying to do, having a second romance, I think it simply would not have worked. There was not time in this 1 hour and 45 minutes to have this virus, have the apes escape, and to try to do two romances, especially when one of them was very underdeveloped anyway.
Yeah, I'm glad they cut that out. But unfortunately, we'll talk about this next week. Again, Judy Greer is like that love interest, that wife, and she just gets nothing to do, even as the fucking wife in the next movie. But we'll get to that when we talk about it next week. But yeah, I'm glad they kept it to the one romance angle, because I was thinking that too. Like, I couldn't remember if they had a romance angle in the first one when I was watching Dawn in theaters in 2014, and I was like trying to remember, and I guess it was a 10-year gap. So I'm glad they kind of leave it open-ended a little bit. Then, it lets you have imagination, just kind of, fill in the blanks a little bit. And they picture this, romance in the woods or whatever, and then they have their kids and whatever. But I'm glad they kind of left that open, because I like that jump, because at the start of the second, when he's like all warriored out and stuff, and here it's him learning to become a warrior. And there's some little things too that I want to mention. Like, I think the moment that he finally turns his back on Will and shuts the door on him, that's the first time I think they changed his face, where it actually looks like the Caesar's face that we see in 2 and 3. Because it's like the first half of the movie, when he's maturing, his face is not fully, evolved, or fully featured. Once he closes the door, it's like he mans up and becomes the Caesar that we know. So I thought that was very symbolic in terms of like that symbolism. Kind of reminds me of Michael Corleone in Godfather 1, where at the beginning of the movie he's very subservient and he's like, yes sir, no sir, and by the end of the movie, or halfway through, when he kills the cop and the other gangster, and then becomes this, like, man's up, you know what I mean? So I thought that was a nice little subtle thing they did, and then the look on his face kind of reflected that.
Does that make Koba Fredo in this scenario? Or I guess he's more Sonny than Fredo.
I was thinking that, but I was thinking more of the guy that sold him out in Italy. You know what I mean?
All right. So I think the things that work, we've talked about the visuals, and this movie doesn't work if you don't believe that Caesar is a fully realized character. Visually, the sign language part of it just doesn't work, because I don't think the human part of it doesn't necessarily take me out of the movie, because I think it's average. But if I'm not invested in the apes and their struggle and their escape and being invested in wanting to see them escape, then the movie doesn't work, right?
That's kind of where I'm at too, because I feel like what they're trying to set up, and especially in the later ones, is like the humans are always going to be the subplot in these movies, I think, and that should be I think the focus should be on the apes and Caesar, and he should be the main focus, and the humans, despite having amazing casting choices, like it's not going to be what it could be because they're not the primary focus, if that makes sense. So I feel like, especially when they put Gary Oldman in that role, and he only has like 6 scenes total, it's what it is. But that's the second one. But I feel like that's the way they set it up, and you need to have that focus on the apes and have it's all about them. And I feel like the humans are just secondary to their story, and humans are just part of their story, and the main story is their evolution and to where they end up in the end. But yeah, that struggle, man, it's very powerful stuff to watch, and I think that's your emotional investment.
Yeah, and I think this idea of the apes in cages, I mean, cages can have a lot of metaphors. You've got the prison metaphor, you've got literal, again, kids in cages. There's a lot of connections to be made with this idea, and I think that the movie handles it really well. I don't think it necessarily is beating you over the head with the metaphor. I just think the metaphor works, and the fact that they are able to escape, and the fact that Caesar becomes radicalized by his enslavement, basically, I think is a really powerful idea. I mean, this is something that we see in the real world all the time, that people who get put into literal cages or metaphorical cages, they kind of find themselves and they realize who they are. I mean, Malcolm X is a great example of this from history. I mean, he's somebody who basically found himself when he was in prison. And I don't think that that's an accident, that the same thing happens to Caesar in this movie. And I think it really works. It really works tremendously well. And when you think about the cage part of it, you've also kind of got to have the bad actors. And in this case, I mean, you literally cast Malfoy and Logan Roy as bad people. And it doesn't get any better than Tom Felton and Brian Cox, respectively. I mean, if I was going to find 2 really evil people to make me sympathize with the apes against human beings, you cannot cast 2 better people than literally Malfoy and Logan Roy.
Yeah, I kind of wish they did a little bit more with it, but I was satisfied when, unfortunately, Malfoy died. I don't think Caesar knew that he was going to kill the guy. I think he just shot him with the hose instinctively. But then he learned about electricity and water at that same time in that moment, so who knew? But Brian Cox's character is interesting as well. I just felt like there could have been more to that. I don't know. I felt like Brian Cox played a subtle son of a bitch when he could have been a little bit more over the top son of a bitch like we know him as. You know what I mean? Like an X2 a little bit. But yeah, it was what it was, and I thought they could have done a little bit more with the villains, or quote unquote villains of the movie. Because they're the evil captives or captors, I should say, and yeah, there's just a lot going on there. But yeah, I felt like they needed more time, but because they didn't show up until like the second half of the movie, I thought, or it felt like. So again, just interesting casting, but effective for the little parts they were in it. But I felt like Brian Cox could have been a character that could have just stretched out into the other movies as well, kind of in the background, just kind of being that evil, foil, a long-term enemy to Caesar, but they kind of cut him short.
I mean, I don't necessarily have an issue with how either one was used, and I think by having Brian Cox's character be more subtle, I think it allowed Tom Felton to kind of go all the way and be the complete opposite of subtle, because that's what he was, and I think that's by design, and I think it works. I mean, ultimately, I think our satisfaction is seeing Caesar do what he does to that character, and in that moment, you really realize that you're rooting for the apes. You are not rooting for the human beings anymore. And I think that is very powerful, and that's really important. And I think there's 2 other things I want to point out that I still think work about this movie. The start of a killer virus. I think that it is something that we are unfortunately all too familiar with. One of the things that Rise of the Planet of the Apes does not really make clear, though, they do show that Franklin dies, but Franklin coughed on the neighbor of Will, and that neighbor was a pilot, and the idea is that because he was a pilot, that's why it was able to spread so quickly. And that's not really something that either this movie or Dawn makes clear, and that's why I'm making it clear that that's really how the virus gets started, because this person is a pilot and he spreads it. The other thing I want to point out about this neighbor is, based on his behavior, the way that he emotionally responds to Will and responding to his father, why is he an airline pilot? He's very angry.
Yeah, that was kind of weird too. It felt like, I don't know, like when they said he was a pilot at the end, I was kind of like, huh? It just didn't feel. I mean, the house, yeah, that makes sense with that nice ass house in San Francisco and that kind of market. Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, it was just, I don't know. I thought that they were gonna go in a different direction with his character. I thought they were gonna reveal that he's like a evil something. You know what I mean? Like a really bad person. But he just happened to be a bystander in the way of all the shit going on, and he just, his car happened to be there when the father, John Lithgow, wanted to have one of his Alzheimer's type episodes and take the car out, and it was unfortunate that he got coughed on by the doctor friend. Just a lot of bad luck for that guy, and unfortunately, he probably died like 3 days after the movie ends. But yeah, it's kind of unfortunate, and it's so it just hit me, man. It just hit me real. I mean, it hit you probably the same way. Like, God, we're kind of living this, and then the whole thing about Franklin, put your mask back on. I was just laughing out loud in the worst possible way, and just ironically, I guess. But yeah, it was what it was.
And we also see how militarized the police are, which is something that has been discussed a great deal in recent weeks. And even though this is a local police force, it is not the United States military. That is something that comes up later. They have a lot of weapons. They have a lot of ammunition at their disposal. And these SWAT teams are very militarized, and I think that is put into this movie by design. And even if we didn't realize it in 2011, in 2020, it really stands out.
Yeah, a lot of firepower for the California Highway Patrol. I realized that it was the CHP the second time around watching this, and I was like, oh, it's not really like the military, it's the CHP. So I was like, well, they got a lot of firepower, and then they were just filling up the bridge and all that stuff. So yeah, it did really, it starts to hit when you realize how much funding the cops have in this country and the kind of funding they get for their weapons, and it kind of opens your eyes a little bit. And maybe just, we've been ignoring it all this time, or maybe just not having the right kind of eye on it. But seeing it now, yeah, especially in the ending on that bridge, man, like so much going on. Like, the apes don't have guns, man. All the guns come from the humans in that battle. So there you go.
And that's going to be an important part of next week as well, talking about apes and guns and all that business. That does become important. I think the only things that really don't work, I think, with James Franco, and the thing is that I don't think that James Franco is unwatchably bad. Again, I think this comes down to there are parts of this movie that are so good, and then this is like just average. And when I think about James Franco and the drug plot line and him trying to save his father, I think that's what it comes down to. And I like John Lithgow as much as the next guy. I think he's done some really interesting and nuanced performances, but the way that Alzheimer's is portrayed in this movie, it seems very cartoonish, and they really only focus on certain aspects of it. And maybe this is because I feel like I know so much more about what Alzheimer's is and how people respond to it. They certainly get some of it right, but it kind of feels like a cartoon at certain points. And I think that was a lot of my issue with it. The cheesy callbacks to the original. Again, there's certain things that I think acknowledging and echoing prior movies, I think that can work sometimes. And there are examples where I think it does work. Having a character named Caesar, that works. Calling one of the apes Maurice, perfect. That works out really well. But I think some of the lines of dialogue, I think that's kind of where it comes off really, really goofy. And it's something that thankfully is not as prevalent in the next two movies like it is here. And the other issue, Brian, I think all three of these movies have the wrong title. I think this is actually Rise of the Planet of the Apes should actually be called Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I think Dawn of the Planet of the Apes should be called War, and War should be called Dawn.
I kind of agree with you there, because I always mix these titles up all the time. But yeah, I agree on that, because like the way you mentioned, or the way you describe the words and stuff, it makes sense when you do it that way. But again, the mind just confuses them anyway. We're just gonna call them 1, 2, and 3, or at least call 2 and 3 in the Matt Reeves movie. So, for me, what doesn't work, I mean, it's weird because like when they first escape, right? You think there's a certain amount of apes total. Like it's not as many as you think. And then once they go to the drug place Genesis and they break out the apes there, I start to lose count of actually how many apes there are, because by the time you get to the Golden Gate Bridge, it seems like there's like hundreds of them. So I don't know if they just started adding random apes to the mass or whatever, because the numbers just don't add up in my head. Like I felt like there was not nearly as many at captivity in that sanctuary, and then even when they had the ones in experimenting, there was only like a dozen of them. So like, where are all these apes coming from? I just felt like they keep adding them, and they just keep appearing from nowhere. And then the other things I mentioned before is like the size and scale issues, because at times it just felt like Caesar was as tall as James Franco, and then other scenes he was shorter than him. And I don't know if that's because he wasn't fully standing up straight, or I know apes don't do that fully. They kind of hunch a little bit, but I don't know. It just seems like the heights were a little off, because it seemed like some of the apes were like really like small. And I know there's different species and stuff like that. I know Koba's a Bondo ape, but it just felt like they kept adding more and more, and all these apes just keep appearing out of nowhere, and they just kept multiplying out of nowhere. So I felt like they kind of went a little too ape crazy with the CGI and the numbers of everything. And once they realized that they needed more, they just kept adding more for no reason. It felt like on the bridge.
I hadn't really thought about that until you just mentioned it, but I can definitely see your points about the number of apes being an issue. And I think the reason it is an issue is that when you're CGIing things, I think you might lose some track. But they also did go to the zoo and pick up a few apes as well. But it still felt like there were 100 of them, and they're between the sanctuary, between the lab, and between the zoo, there's no way they could have that many. So I think that's a fair point by you.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. And they have the same problem in Dawn, because a bunch of apes get annihilated there, but then it seems like there's just as many. So I don't know what's going on, because it feels like, I don't know. And then where do they get all the other, virus canisters to turn them into smarter? You know what I mean? It's like, there was like some weird, like in that whole montage and sequence of things going on, they skipped some stuff, felt like. And then I guess you just assumed the logic in between and just, they just got all smart, even though the only ones in the sanctuary got smart. But that was, again, it's just.
Isn't that a virus thing where they could like breathe on each other and make each other smarter? I mean, I'm not saying that's a great.
I thought that too, but then it's like, well, then I don't know, because they were spitting out blood, and that was the human thing. So it gets you know what I mean? Like it gets confusing at that point. So I felt like they should have explained that a little more. Because then, what about the other apes around the world? Like, are they going to get affected? Like, you know what I mean? Like, they're not.
Well, we do see that one ape who is not in this little group that eventually becomes an important part of the story.
Right. So I wish they would have explained that a little more, because it felt like that, between the point where they escape and to the point in the Golden Gate Bridge, it was just a rush 10 minutes to get all the apes going crazy. And then they kind of didn't really explain all the stuff going on. But I guess it's just assumed. Again, but because I wonder, like, did they get more canisters in the future in that 10-year gap? Do they, convert more apes to higher intelligence? It's really weird, but we do know that it's spread, like paternally. So if you have a kid, it's going to spread to your kid. So I guess that's how they, populate the planet eventually through generations.
All right, let's talk about MVP. For me, the MVP, I think, it's going to be the same for this and Dawn. I think it's the visual effects artists. I think that you certainly have your issues with the visual effects, and I certainly understand that, and I think it is legitimate, but I have a hard time giving it to Rupert Wyatt, who is the director of this movie, given that he would not direct the sequels, and I think there's some fundamental story problems, so I don't feel like giving it to either the director or the screenwriters. So I think just the fact that they were able to get Caesar to look as good as Caesar looks, for me, is more than enough to say that this movie that it's worth giving this award to them, because what they are able to do and just make Caesar a fully realized character that doesn't feel like a CGI creation. And I think that has certainly been a problem in some movies and TV shows where you have these characters who are mostly CGI and it just doesn't work. But in this case, I really think it does. And on a similar note, best performance, Andy Serkis. The human characters are not very impressive in this movie. I certainly am not going to give it to James Franco. Brian Cox really isn't in the movie enough to justify it, and neither are any of the other actors. So in a similar vein, giving credit to the visual effects artists who put this together, and Andy Serkis, who continues to excel and continues to be really impressive.
Yeah, I'll go with MVP, despite my kind of critique on the visuals and the CGI towards the end. I still got to give him credit, so I'll give him the MVP because the way that they brought Caesar to life and, just made you sympathetic towards him and humanized him and made you part of his journey, and you see him grow up. I thought that was just the way they did it was beautiful, and the way that they did the baby Caesar, that looked really good. So all that stuff, credit to the team, the special effects team, for creating that, because what they had to do in this movie, they had to establish it for the rest of the movies. You know what I mean? They had to establish the look by the end of it, what the apes would look like, and they got it right, despite them multiplying constantly at the end. But I think what the main thing is that they set the visual tone right by the end of the movie, them in the woods and all that kind of thing, and them banding together. So best performance, yeah, Andy Serkis for sure. Like I said, I think just some very powerful moments. And then I think for me, we forget to mention the window. There's just something about that beautiful image of the window that kind of represents that idea of looking through the window and the cage and being held back and all that kind of thing. So there's some great symbolism there. And then when he draws the window on the concrete wall of his cage, I thought that's a great moment too. And just the way that, Andy Serkis is you can tell he's putting all his effort into that performance, just fucking drawing a window on a wall and just being heartbroken about it. You know what I mean?
For sure. And I mean, I walk away from Rise of the Planet of the Apes overall, and I think it's a really solid first entry. And they really do a great job of planting seeds. We didn't really talk about Koba that much, but the role that Koba plays is really important in this movie, in that we understand kind of his issues, the fact that he has been tortured a lot, and the fact that he is also very intelligent, just as Caesar is. But you don't really they really explore that a lot more in the second one. But I really like the seeds that they laid down with Koba and establishing him as a potential rival for Caesar, and just that visual difference. He kind of looks more evil, doesn't have an eye and whatnot. So I really love what they did there. And they do that with the virus. They do that with this movie in general. They lay a lot of seeds that are going to get grown and expanded upon in future movies. I don't think this movie is perfect, but I think that this movie is definitely, I think if you're going to sit down and watch this trilogy, I don't see any reason to skip Rise, because there is a lot going on here that is going to get referenced in future movies. And I think there is enough here to justify saying that it's worth watching and recommending.
Yeah, I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Very solid. Just like I said, the human stories I think get the back seat in all these Apes movies now, and I think the focus should be on Caesar and the family and all that stuff. So the way they approached the script, I think it made sense, and in terms of that, by the end of the movie, it's all about Caesar, not even about James Franco and Will anymore, and it's not about his dad, and it's not even about the humans anymore because they're gone. So the way they put that together, I think it was well done. So 7.5 out of 10 for me, very solid. It only gets better with the change of director and cinematographer.
Yeah, I would say 7.5 or an 8 is probably about the direction that I would go into as well. So that is our conversation on Rise of the Planet of the Apes. We, of course, are going to talk about the second movie, which is also misnamed, and I'll probably talk about being misnamed again next week. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is what we are talking about next week, and this is Matt Reeves' first entry into the Ape series, and I'm very much looking forward to having a discussion on this. So, for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
In a world gone mad, we will not spank the ape, but the ape will spank us.